Welcome to the Project Zion podcast. This podcast explores the unique spiritual and theological gifts Community of Christ offers for today's world.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Project Zion podcast. This is Brittany Mangelson, and I'm going to be your host for today. And today I have on a good friend. And actually, when I say good friend, I mean good friend. It's been a minute since we've been in touch. And so we just chatted for 40 minutes before we started recording. So I am thrilled to welcome my friend Molly Bagley on the podcast. This is going to be a Chai Can't Even episode, which is where we talk to adults, young adults in Community of Christ who really grew up in the church and just let them share their story and share their stories of discipleship formation and then their hopes and dreams for Community of Christ. So Molly, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And I just have to say, we, there's kind of this running joke about, I don't know if joke is the right word, but like who should be on Chai Can't Even, like who is considered a millennial or who is considered a young adult? Cause we're kind of in this weird transition phase where we just, have been a young adult and now we're maybe just a regular adult in the church. But I have to say that Molly is wearing a Daria shirt, which I didn't mention before, which is like the perfect generational marker for this like millennial, exennial, like born and raised in the 80s and 90s. And so, that's the era that we're going to be talking about a lot today. So I'm thrilled. I'm excited. I'm going to stop talking. And Molly, why don't you just introduce yourself really quick? Just let us know where you're at, what you're up to, and then we'll dive on into the bulk of the interview.
Okay. So I'm currently in Atlanta, Georgia. I moved here in 2019 to attend Candler School of Theology at Emory University. I have just completed the coursework for my Master of Divinity. I graduate tomorrow. We're recording this on the 6th. I graduate the 7th. I'm extremely excited. It was 3 years of a lot of work. So right now I am just enjoying not having to do things and not having to worry about turning things in and just enjoying my time. And I grew up in Pensacola, Florida, attending the North Pensacola congregation. Originally, I was born in Independent, but we moved to Pensacola mid-'80s. So that's pretty much what I remember. I'm currently at the Atlanta North congregation.
Awesome. Thank you. And I, when I realized that tomorrow was graduation day for you, I felt a little guilty asking you to do this podcast, but I know that it's been a fun experience for me so far. I'm assuming that our listeners can tell by like my super chattiness in my intro, and I'm just like really happy to be here. So this is going to be good. So Molly, let's just dive in. So you were born and raised Community of Christ. So you said you were born in Independence and then moved to Pensacola when you were young. So I am curious to know what your church experience looked like growing up. So did you attend youth camps? Were you like mentored in your congregation? Did you feel like you were a burden, or did you feel like, you were really part of the community? Just talk about growing up in the church.
So up until I was at Graceland when the name change happened when I was at Graceland. So growing up was still RLDS. I, as a young child, just thought it was too long. I would try to shorten it. And a couple of times I dropped the reorganized, and I realized the problem with that one day. I was at daycare, and my daycare was right next to the LDS church in Pensacola. And so I said the name of the church, but I dropped the reorganized, and they're like, "Oh, that one right there." And I looked, I was like, no, that's not my church. So I realized that is an important word in the name, but I still felt it was just so long and complicated to say as a young kid. But I did grow up going to camps. First camp I went to, I was 8. So started right away, and I went almost every summer. And then by the time I was a teenager, I was basically spending my summers at Bluff Springs campgrounds. I would be a counselor junior camp, a CIT at junior high. I would attend senior high camp as a camper. I would go to reunion, and the youth when I was younger, we had a really sizable youth group, or number of youth grew up attending Sunday school with the same group of people. As we got older, some moved away, some just kind of didn't attend as much. As teenagers, it got much smaller. I think there were like 3 or 4 of us really attending regularly. So I actually started working with the younger kids pretty early on. I was probably 15 or 16, and on Wednesday nights, I would teach the youth class on Wednesday. So I really was mentored in that aspect, as far as people seeing where I had gifts in those areas and working with kids and the youth, and really kind of empowering you. Like, you don't necessarily have to be like an adult to do this. Like you can do this. And so I was mentored in that aspect quite a bit. And when I was looking at the outline of the questions, I was thinking back on my camping experience. And I think that was probably one of like my favorite things about growing up in the church was our camps and reunion. And I mean, there were summers, I wouldn't even go home between camps. We'd just do our laundry there and stay overnight, and we'd just be there when the next camp started, because that was our summer. That was it. That was really formative as far as teaching leadership and spirituality and developing with my friends that way. Because at our camps, we would have all the way from like Panama City over to Louisiana. So there was always a really large group of us. Got smaller as we got to senior high camp, but that made our senior high camp so nice and like intimate, and you just really knew everybody there. I really enjoyed that too. But I I don't think I ever felt like a burden. I think at times, because I was so into like, I would be the one that would kind of be like, okay, well, you can help with the kids during this business meeting. So like as a teenager, I didn't necessarily participate in that part of the church. I was always like helping with the younger kids so that the adults could be in there. So I didn't necessarily feel like much of that part of the church. That's something I noticed that changed when I became an adult. We definitely we encouraged our teenagers much more to participate in the business part of the church and the importance of that. So I think one thing I wish I would have had more of a focus there in like seeing myself as part of the working part of the congregation, and the opinions in that way mattered. But I also don't feel like that necessarily hindered my development as a church member or anything.
That makes sense. And I think that it's interesting seeing like my own kids, my own, 11-year-old twins. And I have an 8-year-old who's getting ready to be baptized, but this transition of like being, a consumer of church, but then recognizing that when you're baptized, I mean, you have voice and you have vote and you have, your opinions. You are a member of the congregation. And so you do have opinions that can be considered. And that transition of, being the person who gets ministry as a child at camps, at things like that, and then going from this member that has more of like a logistical buy-in, if you will, to the congregation. That's something that I'm like, oh, should I be explaining this more to my kids? Should they be playing or paying attention more to the business meeting rather than, just like running around in the back? Like, actually, they're 11, like they could have some sway in this. So that's, yeah, I think that I don't know, transition is something that I'm assuming a lot of people go through as they're growing up in the church. Cause I mean, I didn't have that experience, but it's interesting watching my kids now go through that. And I'm like, oh yeah, being a parent in Community of Christ, I'm supposed to like teach you how to do the thing. And that's, yeah, it's interesting. So I also think it's interesting that you recognized at a young age, that there was the LDS church that was next to your daycare, but like that was not what you were. So what was your general understanding of, the similarities, the differences, our shared history with the LDS church?
So my dad is an elder, and I'll just throw in, I'm not related to Del Bagley. My dad is Joe Bagley. That's like the number one question I get when I meet people. But anyways, he's an elder and has always been knowledgeable about church history. And so I was also a curious kid. And so, I grew up knowing about Joseph Smith. And then after Joseph Smith was killed, that there was the Brigham Young led the Group West, but that our church believed he had set apart his son and waited. This was my understanding as a kid, waited for Joseph Smith III to kind of come of age and to be willing to lead the church. And so that is how we were different, and understanding that split, happened in Nauvoo. And, I remember being told about the, Palmyra and Kirtland and Nauvoo and then to independence. And so understanding about that, the area I grew up in has a staggering number of Southern Baptist congregations. When I attended seminary through Graceland as well, and one of our assignments was to do kind of a survey of the makeup of our area, like where do the poor people live, what's the majority religion. And I think in my county at the time, so this was like 2015, I think in one county there were like 98 Southern Baptist congregations. So with the name, there was definitely this, I definitely heard you're in a cult a lot. I remember growing up and hearing, we had a group that would participate in like ecumenical sports teams, and there were teams that would not pray with us before the game. Or I remember going to a youth event with a friend, and her father talked, our parents met, the first time we had like a sleepover and things like that. And I knew that her father was not a fan of our church, because I was allowed to go to events at their church and to attend their church, and she was not allowed to come to youth events at my church. And so before events, my dad would kind of prep me. He would be like, you're going to be asked if you're saved, and here's a way you can answer that question. Because I didn't grow up with this concept of, yes, I was saved. I was saved at this point. It was, I'm saved through the grace and sacrifice of Christ on the cross kind of thing. And so he would help me to kind of preform some answers. It sounds like putting words in my mouth, and I don't want to give that impression, but it was a way to help me to enter into these conversations with people. And so I remember going to an event, and when it came time for the youth group to go inside and plan a worship activity, I was not allowed to go. I stayed outside with someone filling up water balloons for water balloon volleyball later, and was grilled on my faith. So I did have those kind of experiences. And I don't think that the impact of that hit me really until I was an adult. And like kind of the knowledge of what was happening there, and the fact that it was my church, and that we were so in people's minds so closely connected with the LDS church because of the name, and knowing that the Book of Mormon was in the canon and that kind of thing. So
that is so interesting. And I mean, to be clear, tragic. I mean, to have to be able to be prepped like that as a little kid, but it also feels relatable. And I think it's really great that your dad was able to frame your faith in a way that would empower you instead of othering you, right? Instead of like making sure that you had a target on your back. It was a sign of protection, and to be able to give you words and language to articulate your faith that wouldn't just automatically other you, I think is actually brilliant parenting. And something that I wish that, I guess, more parents on, like both quote unquote sides of the religious aisle, the belief system of, literal, maybe even fundamentalism. And then, on the other end of the spectrum, maybe just pure secularism, could come together and understand that at the end of the day, like these are just kids on a playground, right? Like these are kids. And so putting our own religious baggage on them is harmful. So I think that your parents were very wise to be able to help you articulate your faith in a way that would allow you to foster relationships while you're growing up. So as you moved into adulthood, so you said you went to Graceland. So how did that look? I mean, you were active in congregational life through growing up, being a teenager, and then did you continue that once you got to Graceland? I'm curious to know, did you feel pressure to only date people within Community of Christ, or were you pressured to remain active? What kind of Graceland experience did you have?
So I loved my Graceland experience, and I really came full circle theologically during that time too. Did a lot of breaking down my own theology and reconstructing it, and leaving with, I went in with strong faith, maybe a little bit naive faith, but definitely in, I never really had like a major theological crisis then or anything. I wanted to learn, and I loved learning. And I, one of those people that like when something like, I have ADD, so I have that superpower of hyperfocus. And so when something interests me, I'm like, all right, this is my life. And so I started I was an art major. My minor was church leadership, and I was taking some religion classes and leadership classes. And so, I definitely had that experience of, my freshman year, it's kind of rambling, but my freshman year, I was in a communion service, and that's the first time I discerned that I had a call to ministry. Was just communion was being served, and I just kind of had this awareness that someday that would be my role. I would serve in that capacity. And then shortly thereafter, Graceland became a recognized as a congregation and a delegation by World Church, and had a delegation at conference and things like that. And the campus ministers could process priesthood calls, and I was not called at that time. So that I entered into a period of a little bit of disillusionment at that point, wondering what I was or wasn't doing that wasn't bringing about that call. And so I did drift away, there were regular services on campus and activities, and I did drift away from attending church regularly for a while, and then kind of got to a point in my life when I was like, okay, wait, I'm making some decisions that aren't how I want my life to go. So let me circle back around to being more involved again in church. And I never was completely separate. Like I would still participate in services. I served as chaplain, actually became chaplain of the hall. I was on Ponavy. So at semester, my freshman year. And so I did it for spring semester, my freshman year, and then fall and spring, my sophomore year. And so I was still involved that way, but trying to figure out what involvement and leadership look like when you're not priesthood was part of my journey. And that continued well after Graceland as well. But so that was part of my experience. I don't think I ever felt pressured to like date anyone that was just only in the church or not. I knew it would be easier because there was always this, because growing up where I did, it's like, there's always this how do I explain this to people? But usually people, when they come to Graceland, have some they may not know a lot about Community of Christ, just because there are some excellent programs at Graceland, just academically and sports related and things like that. But generally, people developed some understanding of the church, so you didn't have to explain too much. But I also, I think I only dated like 2 people when I was at Graceland. I kind of was always the friend, never the girlfriend syndrome in high school and college. But I don't think I felt that pressure there. And I don't even think I felt pressure to be involved or not involved in the church activities there. I didn't want to lose that connection, but I think it was also good for me to have that little bit of space that I created for myself to kind of grow a little bit more while I was there. And then also while I was there, one summer I did internship as a tour guide in Nauvoo. And that point was probably one of the points where I really kind of continued to fall in love with my church, really dug even more into the history and to how we developed to where we are today. And so that's where that process kind of started for me, and that continued. And that I did a lot of that exploration when I was at seminary through Graceland as well, and looking at where we've come history-wise and theologically to where we are now. And so that kind of started when I was at Graceland, doing that internship and taking classes like restoration studies and restoration scriptures with Bill Russell and things like that.
So I know that you said that growing up, you had, some understanding of church history, but as you became a young adult and were at Graceland and taking these classes and being in Nauvoo, was it challenging to learn more church history? I mean, did it spark any sort of faith crisis in you, or, make you question the roots of our movement in a way that felt threatening?
I don't think at that point. That came along more later on. I mean, I definitely, learning more about Nauvoo, I definitely had thoughts of like, well, that kind of went off the crazy train a little bit. But just some different teachings developing during that time. But I think that helped me to start to be critically aware, but really my kind of crisis with that didn't hit until I was attending the Community of Christ Seminary later on down the road, actually. And there was some space. So I graduated from Graceland in 2006, and I did not start attending seminary until 2015 is when I started there. I put them intentionally and unintentionally. Right after I graduated from Graceland, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder. So there were some years of kind of trying to get that under control and then working and then feeling like I was in a stable place. And so that's when I went back to school for my master's in religion. And that was the point when we're learning more about scriptural development and church history that I started to wonder, okay, what do I do with Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon? What do I think about this? And how does what I think, like, if I think that the Book of Mormon is a product of Joseph Smith and a product of its time, and maybe not necessarily directly from a set of golden plates. What does that do for people who have a very strong testimony of the Book of Mormon? That's where I struggled. How can I reconcile my beliefs with these really powerful experiences that I grew up hearing of people who really delved into the Book of Mormon and who have strong testimonies of its impact in their life, and wondering about that. And that's where my crisis kind of started. And I'm not sure I can answer that question even today. I think that's still something that I kind of wrestle with a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you for being honest about that, because I think that, as wonderful as it is to be in a church that allows for such a broad range of perspectives on the Book of Mormon or church history and our theological development as a movement, it's really, really difficult for individuals to kind of find themselves and place themselves on that spectrum of belief, especially when, I've heard the term legacy member, when you have generations of your family invested in this and invested in this story. And I relate to that as well. I have, I'm a legacy restoration person myself. And it is difficult, right? Because our grandparents and great grandparents, et cetera, cherished this text, cherished these stories, and had really powerful experiences with them that we heard about, and people in our congregations. And so then to be presented with new ideas about the text, a different way of potentially looking at it, it's really difficult to try to piece apart what is history and what is myth and what is tradition and what is just all these different ways of looking at it. And then where is God speaking in the midst of this? And what does that mean for our community today? So I just want to acknowledge that while I often celebrate the diversity of belief in Community of Christ, it can be really difficult to get to that point where any individual is, confident in claiming their place and their belief. And I still feel like I'm all over the map. And so I appreciate hearing you say, I'm still not quite sure what I think about all these things, because there's just so many different ways to look at it. And I think it's so easy to get stuck in it's either all true or it's all false. And I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And, that's a difficult journey and a lifelong journey, I think, to take. So thank you for being honest about that.
You're welcome. I believe, when I think about the Book of Mormon and about Joseph Smith, I love this vision of the church that Joseph Smith started. And I think it's this beautiful vision of Zion. One of my favorite passages comes from Doctrine and Covenants 36. They were people of Enoch were of one heart and one mind, and there were no poor, dwelt together, and there were no poor among them. I think it's such a beautiful vision of Zion. It's one of my favorite things. And I grew up with my dad telling me about Enoch City and telling me about that. And I think, and so that was part of that, coming into that, okay, well, what do I still think about this? What do I think about the Book of Mormon? What's inspired? And so I do believe that there is inspiration. I believe that Joseph Smith is absolutely inspired by God to start this church. And I love it. I love it so much. But it is there are still points that I struggle with. It's like, what do I really think about that? And do I know? No, I don't. I don't know that yet.
But you're in a community with a lot of people that don't know. So
yeah, that's the thing. I've always known that I had the freedom to ask questions, and that I had the freedom to explore these things, and that the conclusion I came to wouldn't necessarily be wrong. Like, the person sitting next to me may not agree with my conclusion, but that doesn't make them wrong either, because we each got to where we are through very personal and authentic experiences.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And a perfect way to sum up that tension that we were talking about with that spectrum of belief. So it's something that is so different from my childhood, but I appreciate it so, so much. So thank you. Thank you for highlighting that. So Molly, I'm curious because, having grown up in a community that did not necessarily empower women with a lot of leadership skills, or, skills to be able to communicate or to have conflict resolution and just being builders of a community. I'm always just really struck by the folks in my generation that grew up in Community of Christ, because there seems to be maybe a gap in my understanding of, or in my skill set of how to effectively build community. And so I'm curious, as you grew up in the church and as you were mentored and felt like you were, part of this decision-making community, in what ways do you think that you were empowered to essentially be an adult, like a functioning adult? I just feel like Community of Christ does a really good job at teaching humans how to be an adult. So can you speak about that a little bit? Any sort of like leadership skills you feel like you learned growing up?
So as I've been at Candler, which is a Methodist institution, sponsored by the Methodist Church. And so, but it's multi-denominational. I've realized what a unique experience it is to grow up with no memory of, like, I don't remember a time in the church when a woman was not at the pulpit. And what a unique experience that is. I have friends who are incredibly triggered when they are in a service and a man is at the pulpit preaching, because of harmful experiences that they had growing up. And I don't have that. I don't remember a time when a woman couldn't be a leader in our church. And so, it's hit me recently that there is an entire generation who don't remember, that they don't know that what it was to not have women in leadership roles. And so, like, I always knew that one day could be part of my life, that I could have a leadership role in church if things went that direction and if that was part of my calling. And I had some great female models of that as well. And both in my family and in my congregation, who really took the time to mentor me. We had a youth leader when I was in high school, and she really took the time to really kind of empower me as far as my involvement in church and seeing where I had value. I always felt valued, and that what I had to offer was important. And in that way, yeah.
I absolutely love hearing that, because again, I've brought up my kids a couple times, but just knowing that they're also part of that generation of just like not really having a recollection of a time where women weren't at the pulpit. We joined Community of Christ when my girls were really young. And so it gets me excited to know that they're not going to carry around that same baggage about their gender that I have carried. And then knowing that, this whole generation, and really, we're getting into like second generation of Community of Christ folks that just understand that women and men are equal. And I really appreciated that you pointed out that because of how you grew up, you're not triggered by men in the same way, right? Because you haven't had those experiences where you felt excluded by men. And so it's not like you have to be defensive around men and, like fight for your place at the pulpit because it's just there. And so I really think that speaks to the beauty of the healed relationship between men and women that has come since 1984 in Community of Christ. And it also makes me excited for our, further progress with the LGBTQIA+ community, and recognizing that we have a lot of work to do still, but if we look at the healed relationship between men and women, and we, use that as a model for the straight community, straight cis community with the queer community, it gives me a lot of hope. So thank you for lifting that up.
And I have that exact same hope. Because I am one of the facilitators with Harmony's Welcoming and Affirming Congregations program. And It hit me last week, actually, that we are on the cusp of having a generation that doesn't remember when an LGBTQ plus person couldn't be on the pulpit. We're on the cusp of raising a generation that just knows that as part of their church and as part of their church culture. And I think that is just wonderful. And it gets me so excited to be doing that work with Harmony, and also the work that our church is doing and working for full participation for all persons. And so that gives me a lot of hope. Like, I hope that your kids have that memory of they're always like, there just never was a time when someone was excluded because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity.
Yeah, it makes me excited. We are on the right trajectory, and I'm thrilled for that. So Molly, I'm assuming that, I know you're a bit of a church nerd like myself. So seeing the value in a religious community is something that I think you identify with. But can you speak to that a little bit? And having just completed your MDiv, what do you see as being a benefit for the community at large, as far as religious communities go? I mean, what are the benefits of having religion still be a thing, especially considering that our generation is stereotypically, moving away from religion? What do you think the benefits are for keeping religion around?
I think that at its best, at its like optimal best, religion and religious communities can be safe spaces. Very unfortunately, they have not been, but I think at their best, that's what they should be. And those places where people can come and find community with people that have similar values, that even if you didn't grow up in that same tradition, I think that it provides a structure in your life that is different from others. My experience and my decision making is colored by what I learned growing up, what I've learned from the people in the churches that I have attended, and what I can bring back to that. Even in assignments, when I would be working on stuff, I did this a lot at Graceland, but when I'm working on my MDiv, my thought was always, how can I bring this back to the community? Okay, so I'm writing this ethics paper on environmental degradation and how our churches should respond to this. How can I bring that back locally? How can I bring that to the community? That kind of thing. And so it's provided that kind of structure in my life. And so I think that it is very beneficial. I think even religion, and even just if you don't identify with a religious community, but foster a sense of spirituality, that there's something bigger, and this acknowledgement that there is something bigger in the world and creation than we are. I think that changes your perspective on your place in the world and your place as part of this huge, massive, wider creation.
I really love how you said, that everything that you've done in your education, you try to tie it back to the community, right? And I think that religion and theology and just being open to other people's belief systems really breaks down the barriers that so often just get in the way of progress, right? And so I really like that you acknowledge that religion at its best can break down those barriers and move things forward, while acknowledging that religion is often not always at its best. And so to have ministers that are thinking about theology in a very practical way and how can we make the world better in our context is something that I think is super, super important. So thank you. So with Community of Christ specifically, and maybe you kind of already answered this, but what keeps you involved in church life today? Why Community of Christ? Why do you stay involved with this denomination in particular?
I cannot imagine my life without it, number one, because it's just always been there. One of my favorite things is I always feel like I can go into any Community of Christ congregation. I'm either going to know someone or know somebody who knows someone, but there's also an inherent familiarity across the board that doesn't necessarily come in when you, and yet our congregations are incredibly diverse, but there is like this inherent sense of community. And I think that comes from being a smaller denomination. But, when I started attending Candler, I did start thinking, do I need to look elsewhere? Am I in the right place? And I just kept coming back to, no, this is home. I toyed with the idea. It's like, well, there would be more career opportunities in ministry if I were Methodist or Lutheran or Presbyterian. But I don't know. I just kept coming back. I don't know if it's because this is where I'm ordained and I don't know how to go about using that elsewhere. But I also, when I would think about looking elsewhere or looking at a different church, I would just become so profoundly sad. Because, as a movement, we have changed and developed so much over time, and I'm excited to see where we will go in the future. I've heard from some people of other generations that we are a dying church, and I have just decided that I'm just here until the bitter end. I don't particularly want to leave it. And I think that our theology and our sense of community, I think it is honest that it's the work I've seen this church do with the LGBTQ issues and social and LGBTQ rights and involvement and full participation, that journey that we have started and are continuing. And then more recently with the USA conversations on nonviolence that we've been having, and giving space for our community to talk about that and to share about that together. That's something that's unique that I've noticed, as far as when I'm trying to explain to people this idea of this continuing revelation tradition that we have, that is so much more than just adding to the Doctrine and Covenants. It has to do with our whole communal discernment process, and that no decisions are made in this church without the consent of the body. And so that whole sense of that fosters that broader sense of community, that we have our local communities, but we are also part of this larger body, working together for these common goals, giving space for people for this faithful disagreement. We talked last night was the final USA session, and that was one of the things that we started with, was Blake Smith going over those principles of faithful disagreement, and giving that space for people, and saying, we may disagree on this, but we're still a community. We still love each other, and we give each other that ability to have that exploration.
I absolutely love everything you just said. I relate to it so much, because everything from the feelings of when I have thought about leaving religion, or when I've thought about leaving the Restoration tradition, there's just this overwhelming sense of sadness that has come over me. And I've taken that as a sign that I need to stick with it until the bitter end, like you said. And I have been so moved by these conversations on nonviolence, and attending last night, it was just I had this overwhelming feeling that what we're doing matters. It actually matters. And if we want to make the world a better place, we have to stay in conversation with one another about important issues that matter. And that's what we're doing with these conversations on nonviolence. And so while I recognize that Community of Christ is not the only place to have these conversations and to make this progress towards equality and peace, it's a really good place to do it. And when it's part of your DNA, like literal DNA or your spiritual DNA, I think that it just comes naturally. And so I relate to you. I just can't imagine being somewhere else. I know that when we were first looking into Community of Christ, I had this idea of, maybe we'd go check out other churches, but it just felt like coming home, and it just continues to feel like staying home. And I think for me, if I were to go to another denomination and, join or whatever, it would feel like I was a guest in someone else's home. And I just don't know if I could find that sense of home like I do in Community of Christ. So even though I am a convert, I definitely relate to what you were saying of like, this is just who I am. This is just me. And I think it's really beautiful because we are doing good things in the world, even if we're a little small church. I mean, we're doing good things. So.
I mean, if there's one thing that I have learned, it's before we can think and act globally, we have to do it locally. You have to have a local, intimate knowledge and experience. And then like if you take the environment, one thing, I've read a lot lately by Sally McFaig, who is an ethicist theologian, and she writes on environmental issues. And in her book, Supernatural Christians, it's super, natural Christians, and it's how we should love the earth. And she writes that in order to really love something, you have to know it, and you have to know it well and intimately. And so one of her recommendations is getting to know your environment that you're in. And I think that applies for a lot of things. Before we can start thinking bigger about nonviolence and where you fall on the spectrum, I think it starts small. And then we move outward and these ripple effects happen. So I like to think of like these conversations as us starting locally with these issues, and then we can go bigger. And we can, as individuals, we can think bigger.
And I think that is so important when we look at the history of Christianity and colonialization and the real harm that has been done to other communities because, white European American Christians just assume that we can put our culture on everyone else. But this idea that theology and change really needs to be a local reality before it can, grow and expand and take other cultures into consideration. I think that also is such a beautiful struggle that we have in Community of Christ. And just, from going to the 2 world conferences that I've been at and seeing how the conversations are truly coming from various places in the world. And it's not just, a small handful of people in Jackson County, Missouri, who are making decisions for everyone, that the voices from all corners of the earth where the church is are being part of the conversation. And so, that's another element of Community of Christ that I don't know if other denominations see as much. Just the grassroots nature of our denomination, I think, is really, really important. So what are your thoughts on what's tough about being a millennial in Community of Christ, or I guess just in church in general, or the world in general, but really, because I know there's just so much crossover. And I think you've already mentioned a little bit of it, but what are some of the challenges that you see as being a millennial in Community of Christ?
So as comedian Eliza Schlesinger would say, I'm an elder millennial, one of the wizened, because I was born in 83. So I'm like right on that cusp. And we have, I mean, this, and in a way, this is true for every generation. Like, we've seen so much change, but like, I mean, there have been so many moments when I'm like, I am so glad that smartphones weren't around when I was in college or high school, or that Facebook was not a thing, that I didn't have to deal with all of that. But I feel like millennials get a bad rap a lot of the time. And so, yeah, that's like, I used to get super offended when people would call me a millennial. I was like, no, I'm not a millennial. I'm not that. But what is that? What am I rebelling against? Like, what am I saying? No, I'm not that. And so, yeah, I think maybe just combating that kind of negative image that millennials have gained of not wanting to work hard and not wanting to be involved in more than a cursory level, or being too involved, and being too involved in too many things or things like that. I think that as a generation, millennials can be very focused on working for change and working to change, like, okay, yes, this works, but can we tweak it and make it work better? Or can we change these kind of expectations of what this certain thing should look like? Is it a tradition because it has value, or is it a tradition because we've always done it? And not everyone's open to asking those questions because they're very comfortable in their traditions. And so when we come in and say, I think that it might have greater value if we do it this way, we come up against some pushback and that change. But I think, in order to not be a dying church, we do have to continue to work and change and kind of roll with new ideas and new leaders. And yeah, like at times there's been like this idea of like, we need our younger generations to take up the mantle and to lead our church. And then there's people who maybe aren't quite ready to let go. And so we kind of come up against that, and that can be frustrating. Yeah.
Absolutely. I know that you are not the only person in our generation that has expressed those concerns. And it's hard. It's hard because the world has changed so much, and the needs of the church have changed so much, and the expectation of religion in general, I think, has changed. And so we're kind of all in this transitional phase, and nobody really knows what the future is going to look like. And then you throw in a pandemic, and you throw in financial issues, and you throw in all of these things that it's just tough. There's really tough issues that I think we're all wrestling with. And yeah, it's tough.
Yeah. I think that, especially some of our smaller congregations may need to change how things are done. They may need to change how things operate. And that's very difficult to navigate and to be thinking about, okay, do we, now that we're moving into a more digital age, do we need a building? Can we have a more digital campus for our congregation where we gather at specific times, maybe once or twice a month, maybe we rent a space and we put our financial resources into that? Can we financially support this? What can we financially support? And that is it's a huge change from our traditional idea of church. So there's concerns of, will people, if we're not meeting every Sunday, will people still come? Will they just be online? How can we increase value of digital content so that people still feel like they're getting spiritually fed? How can we still make it feel like a community, but but also, be a viable and vital congregation and not lose membership, but also sustain ourselves in a way that so we don't have to completely shut down a congregation. So that's a really hard place to be in thinking about those things. And it's a big transition. I think that, one thing I noticed when the pandemic started was that a lot of our areas are already set up to do that, though. You look at like the Beyond the Walls community. And, we had, for our congregations that are in more rural areas, that there's more distance between your congregations, maybe more digital content gatherings were already a thing when the pandemic started. And so in some ways we were set up well to do that because those changes have already been made and are beginning to be made. So how do we expand that into other areas and give our congregations the resources to do it well?
Absolutely. I actually was super proud of Community of Christ at the beginning of the pandemic, just seeing how quickly we were able to change and adapt and in some ways continue to do what we were doing before. I mean, we had opened up the way for online communion before the pandemic hit. And so we were already just kind of like right there. And the pandemic just really had us say, okay, we're doing it. We're doing the thing. We're prepped. We're ready to go. We can at least have communion together. So the way that we were able to shift, I think, taught us a lot of lessons that I hope that we can carry into the future for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of the future, what are some of your hopes for Community of Christ and hopes for, the next generation of youth who are being formed as disciples in the church today? And what hopes do you have as a church as we move forward and continue to change and adapt for the different needs that the church is going to have into the future?
Reiterate what I said earlier, about hope for, a generation that doesn't remember a time when an LGBTQ person could not be in the pulpit. It's heartbreaking to discern that someone has a call for ministry and know how powerful their ministry would be, but also know they are prevented because of who they love or their gender identity or something like that. That is heartbreaking. I hope that we have generations that do not know that heartbreak of watching their friends be denied ministry because of that. I want our youth that are growing up now to know we are small, but we can still make a difference. We can still have an impact. That even though our congregations might be smaller than other congregations, that our church numbers overall might be smaller, but like we're small but mighty. Like there's so much potential, and I want them to know and have confidence in that potential and have confidence in their contributions. Like I want them to know that they are valued and they are important and they are vital parts of Community of Christ. And I want our church to be its best and be a safe space. I want people to know that our congregations are safe places to come, that you will be loved and you will be accepted just as you are. You are enough just as you are.
Mic drop. That was awesome. That's the sermon right there. That's it. Oh, Molly, this has been so much fun. I, as we wrap up, I guess just sidebar, I did kind of combine a couple of the questions at the end there, but as we wrap up, I always just like to ask our guests if there's anything else that they would like to say before we sign off. But I also just want to give you a huge congratulations for finishing your MDiv. And I cannot wait to see what steps are next for you in your ministry and your involvement with the church. And I just really appreciate your perspective that you've shared today. And I share a lot of your hopes and concerns and your drive forward in mission, and just to really, I can hear so vividly through what you've shared today, your desire to help make this church be the best that it can be. And just the acknowledgement that, yes, we are small, but we are mighty, and we're having really important conversations and doing really important work. So thank you again for uplifting just all of that, and big congratulations. This is an exciting time for you. So with all of that, is there anything left that I didn't ask or that you wanted to share that just maybe didn't come out in the questions that were asked to you?
I think just reiterating just what a special community I feel like our church is. We have, when you look at the trajectory of where we've been historically, like where we've come as a denomination from 1860 to now, we've hit a lot of challenges. We have made decisions that were not always popular. Women in the priesthood, open communion, LGBTQ full participation, allowing our ministers to perform commitment ceremonies and marriages for same-sex couples, ordaining members of the queer community. I think, we've come a long way, and we've had decisions that have been divisive at times. But I believe that as divisive and as painful as that process has been, we have opened so many doors for people. And I just hope that in the future, the way we as members of Community of Christ live our lives and express our love and passion for our church and for Christ and for Christ's mission, my hope is that as that expression lives out in our lives, that it shows other people what we see in our community, and how we view what the value that we put into living out Christ's mission, and that helps them either find a safe space with us, or even just shows them that there are places where they can find that kind of community themselves, but that our lived witness shows the core of our church and how wonderful we think it is to others. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I really, this has just been so fun. I really appreciate everything that you've shared and your perspective. And it's helped me as I've, kind of wrestled with my own sense of call, and just this idea of like, this does feel little, right? Like, is the work we're doing actually doing anything? And so this is good to be reminded that it does matter. And that even though the world's problems can seem really big and really heavy right now, we are part of a community that is actively trying to make our own communities better, our own neighborhoods better. And that is enough to have hope, right? Like, clinging on to that is worth it. And it's important. So thank you so much for sharing everything, and good luck tomorrow as you graduate and as you prepare for your wedding this summer. I'm just so excited for all the good things that are happening in your life. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Project Zion Podcast. Subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, or whatever podcast streaming service you use, and while you are there, give us a 5-star rating. Project Zion Podcast is sponsored by Latter-day Seeker Ministries of Community of Christ. The views and opinions expressed in this episode are of those speaking and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Latter-day Seeker Ministries or Community of Christ. The music has been graciously provided by Dave Hines.